Donald Trump ushered in the most dangerous era for women's health in America in 50 years. He promised to deliver a Supreme Court that would overturn Roe v. Wade, and that's exactly what he did. Now he's running for president against a dystopian backdrop of forced birth and denial of care, a dangerous and deeply unpopular reality that he owns politically. And the difficulty of running with that record is evident in the increasing desperation of the lies he tells about abortion and women's health care. When faced with the consequences of empowering brutal anti-abortion regimes in red states across the country, he often tells patently absurd lies, claiming that everyone wanted Roe to be overturned, even Democrats. But there's one equally ludicrous lie that needs to be debunked because of how dangerous it is. By now, you've probably heard Donald Trump and his acolytes talk about what they're calling post-birth abortion, claiming that Kamala Harris and other Democrats want to allow, as Trump puts it, the execution of babies. This lie, though it sounds so insane and fringe it's hard to imagine anyone could believe it, was amplified when Trump repeated it at this week's presidential debate.
Under Roe v. Wade,
you
could do abortions in the 7th month, the 8th month, the 9th month, and probably after birth. Just look at the former governor of Virginia. The governor of Virginia said, we put the baby aside and then we determine what we want to do with the baby. The governor before, he said the baby will be born and we will decide what to do with the baby. In other words, we'll execute the baby.
What Donald Trump is describing is murder, not abortion. Post-birth abortion is not a thing. It's just not a thing. The post-birth abortion lie is a deliberate attempt to equate actual abortion, which is health care, to murder, as a means to stigmatize women who need abortions and the doctors who provide them, because you might encounter someone in your own life who believes this dangerous lie, so I want to get into the details of it with you. You'll notice that Trump mentioned the former Democratic governor of Virginia when he pushed the post-birth abortion lie in the presidential debate. Adding a character and some specific detail makes the lie seem more credible. Though he didn't say his name, Trump was referring to Ralph Northam. In 2019, then Governor Northam did a radio interview in which he was asked a question about proposed legislation that would have loosened restrictions on late-term abortions. Northam gave a long and somewhat circuitous answer that touched on the tragic circumstances surrounding the very rare case of late-term abortion. And then he also talked about what would happen if a baby was born with a fetal diagnosis.
When we talk about third trimester abortions, these are done with the consent of obviously the mother, with the consent of the physicians, more than one physician, by the way. And it's done in cases where there may be severe deformities, there may be a fetus that's non-viable. So in this particular example, if a mother is in labor, I can tell you exactly what would happen. The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother.
As Northam's office explained at the time, Northam was speaking of two different circumstances, one in which a catastrophic diagnosis or circumstance would cause a patient to need a late-term abortion, which is extremely rare and done, as Northam notes, only with the approval of more than one physician. And the other is a hypothetical case he addressed if a patient goes into labor and delivers a baby with a fetal diagnosis. In that case, Northam explained the heartbreaking circumstances such families would face, including the very difficult decision around keeping their baby comfortable in their final moments or taking extraordinary measures to prolong their life. The anti-abortion movement took the interview, twisted it, and ran it, using it to claim that Democrats were promoting abortion after birth, or the murder of newborn babies. And now, 5 years later, the same lie is cropping up on the campaign trail. Let's look at the facts. A full-term pregnancy lasts between 39 and 40 weeks. By definition, a late-term or late-in-pregnancy abortion occurs at or after 21 weeks of pregnancy and is extremely rare. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, fewer than 1% of abortions occurred at or after 21 weeks of pregnancy. 80.8% of abortions occurred at or before 9 weeks of pregnancy, and just 5.7% of abortions occur between 14 and 20 weeks of pregnancy, which is considered the second trimester. 0 abortions are performed after the birth of a baby. It sounds bizarre to even have to say that, but in fact, we have been building to this moment for a long time. The anti-abortion movement has been painting women who have abortions and physicians who perform them as murderers for decades. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, quote, common harassment tactic was to find and publicize personal information about doctors in the form of wanted posters. Other times, they would send letters to a doctor's neighbors telling them there's a killer in your neighborhood. From the 1980s to present day, anti-abortion activists have been performing what they call rescues. This has involved everything from blocking entrances to abortion clinics and medical centers to harassing patients, doctors, and workers, and even invading the clinics themselves. It's often involved carrying signs and calling patients and staff who enter clinics murderers. In 1994, President Bill Clinton signed a law which made it a federal crime to physically obstruct clinic entrances or use violence or the threat of violence to prevent someone from obtaining reproductive health care. Some clinics also created buffer zones to keep protesters from getting too close to the entrance and the patients. But that never stopped anti-abortion protesters from showing up with their signs and their pitchforks to this day. The 1980s saw a huge wave of clinic bombings. In 1984, attackers set fire or bombed 29 abortion clinics across the country. According to the National Abortion Federation, since 1977, there have been 42 bombings and 200 cases of arson at abortion clinics across the United States. And yes, over the years, the anti-abortion movement did cross the threshold into straight-up murder. The militant wing of the anti-abortion movement has committed 11 murders since 1977, according to the National Abortion Federation. Two of the most well-known cases are the murders of Dr. George Tiller and Dr. David Gunn. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Dr. Tiller was a frequent target of violence because he was one of the few physicians at the time who was performing late-in-pregnancy abortions. His clinic was bombed in 1986. He was shot in 1993, but he survived. In 2009, a man named Scott Roeder walked into Dr. Tiller's church during a service where Dr. Tiller was serving as an usher and shot Dr. Tiller in the head, killing him. Roeder said he did it to protect babies from being murdered. The first known abortion provider to be assassinated was Dr. David Gunn in 1993. The gunman was a member of the anti-abortion group Rescue America. He shot Dr. Gunn in the back 3 times as he entered his clinic in Pensacola, Florida. In response, Rescue America released a statement saying that while Dr. Gunn's murder was, quote, unfortunate, the fact is that a number of mothers would have been put at risk today and over a dozen babies would have died at his hands. In other words, an eye for an eye. Abortion, they believed, was murder, and so justified murder in response. For decades, the anti-abortion movement has been inviting the violence of extremists among their ranks by equating abortion, which is health care, to murder. And the rhetoric that Donald Trump and others on the right are now spewing fits seamlessly into this tired yet dangerous strategy. Abortion is not murder. Abortion is health care. The post-birth abortion lie was designed to justify the brutal regime of forced birth under which millions of American women are now suffering. It's being used now as a lazy but dangerous strategy by Donald Trump to turn our attention away from the tragedies that have sprung up in the wake of the end of Roe. The rush of stories of women being denied care, left to bleed and suffer, forced to flee their states, saddled with wholly preventable, life-altering medical conditions because of the anti-abortion crackdown ushered in by Donald Trump. But we will not look away, and we will not let this dangerous lie go unanswered.